四部分，拨云见日神的名。如何知道这位神的名字？本集节目让您充分领略尼希米式的论述。在这位加莱特派犹太人对真理十分较劲的思维逻辑里，您会发现神的名字终于剥去了最外一层面纱，显露给我们。如果说新约时代彼得七七节讲道时提到了神的名，还只是合理推测，那么从死海古卷发现的70士译本之希腊文复抄本，就是神的名字Hey Vav Hey的明证。最早的使徒行传和约珥书的希腊文译本里，也都用希伯来文Hey Vav Hey 写下了神的名字。在学界，拔摩海岛的雅威是较为严谨的一本学术论著，但是他认为耶稣在启示录从未说过神的名字的观点被尼希米论证为是错误的。尼希米查考了大英图书馆希伯来文电子数位手稿里2份启示录抄本，发现里面同样提到了神的名，不含母音的写法是Hey Vav Hey， 就是昔在、今在、以后永在的意思。连撒玛利亚人都知道神的名字的意思，虽然他们从不提说。而1世纪的犹太人也提说神的名字，只是到了2世纪初罗马皇帝哈德良的禁令开始，犹太人才不被允许说神的名字。久而久之，神的名字就被希腊字 Kurio 代替在圣经书写中。但是博学缜密的尼希米甚至从由希腊文翻译成的希伯来文启示录里再次论证神的名字就是耶和华。
Yes, prophecy is being fulfilled in the land of Israel even to this very moment. That prophecy that Moses spoke, that the nation of Israel would be scattered throughout the nations of the world and then would be brought back. Jeremiah speaking of that time and what would immediately be the precursors to Israel coming back into the land, and the time of great affliction coming ahead. And then once Israel is in the land, it's still not over. And the Almighty is wanting to make His name and His nature known throughout the entire earth. We then see the prophet Joel, who then details what is really getting set up right now. We're seeing the nations of the world now coming against Israel, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish sentiment and spirit just welling up all over the world, through American universities even. And what is happening right now, we see that things are getting set up. In the prophecy of Joel, he speaks of an invading army that is coming into the land of Israel. Before them, it is like the Garden of Eden. And anyone who's been to Israel, been down the Dead Sea Valley, the lowest point on planet Earth, hot as next to Hades. It is so hot down there, but yet what do you see? Mile after mile after mile of greenhouses filled with vegetation that feeds the world, not just Israel, but it's actually shipped to Japan and goes out all over the world to feed the hungry all over the world. It's like the Garden of Eden now, but when this army comes in, it's like the Garden of Eden before them. Behind them, it is a smoldering, desolate wasteland. Nothing can stop this army. There is no way that they can be impeded. And yet the Almighty calls for His people to call a fast, call everyone to repentance, to call upon the name of Yahovah. And it says that the Almighty fights from heaven for them, that the stench of their enemies goes up into the stratosphere. And then it says, in those days, it says the sun is going to be turned to darkness, the moon into blood. This is because of the war. It's not eclipses it's talking about. It's because of this war, the darkness, the desolation, blackness upon all the faces, the sun turned to darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of
the Lord
shall be delivered. No, it's not the Lord. Nehemiah, help us with this, because we have, we not have Peter on the day of Shavuot also quoting this very verse?
He quotes it verbatim, and definitely in the Greek, in Acts 2:21, it says, "It shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of
what?
The Lord. And there it's the Greek word kurios.
Kurios.
Whosoever call on the name of the kurios shall be saved." And you have to wonder, so when Peter spoke these words in Jerusalem in the first century, and let's assume that he spoke the language that would be spoken, that would be used for a sermon, certainly a sermon in Jerusalem. If you were in the marketplace, you might speak Greek, you might speak Aramaic, you might speak Hebrew.
He's on the Temple Mount on the day of Shavuot.
He's giving a sermon. A sermon's going to be in Hebrew. So he's giving the sermon, and he's saying this in Hebrew. What name did he use? Did he say the Lord? Did he say Adonai? Or did he speak the actual name Yehovah? And if you look back in Joel where we started, it says in the Hebrew, "Whosoever shall call on the name of Yehovah shall be saved." Now, what did the original say? What did Peter originally say? I don't know. It wasn't there. But there's a really interesting clue, Michael. I want to show the audience something. So what we have here is a page from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's two sets of Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the early ones that were put in the caves in the year 68 AD when the Romans came. And then the Romans came back in 135 during what's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. This is from the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It's called 8 Hever 12, which means it was found in Nachal Hever, the 8th cave, scroll number 12. And it's a Greek copy of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Tanakh. And what you can see here very plainly, even if you don't read Greek, is there's one word that appears in this page, which is, again, it's Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23, which talks about 10 men of all the nations coming and grabbing, holding on under the corner of the garment of the Jew, saying, "We have heard Yehovah is with you." That's the passage here.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the name Yehovah, that's written in Paleo-Hebrew. Even though the text is Greek and reads left to right, when you come to the name of the creator of the universe, the Father, in Greek, they wrote Hey Vav Hey in the earliest Septuagint manuscripts as in Paleo-Hebrew.
Right to left.
Right to left, right,
Yeah.
exactly. And what happened is over time, the Jewish tradition came about of not speaking the name, and the Christian scribes said, well, we don't know how to write that word. That's some word we don't know those letters. We know every letter on this page, but these 4 letters, and they eventually replaced it with the Greek word kurios. And so here's the question I have. When Peter wrote this, and let's assume for a second
or spoke it.
When he spoke it and it was written down in Acts, let's even assume it was written in Greek. It was probably, I think it was in Hebrew, Acts, but let's assume it was written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek or written in Greek. Either way, when it was in Greek, would they have done something different in the first century, writing in Greek a sermon quoting the Old Testament than they did with the Old Testament itself? In other words, when they wrote this in Greek and they came to that name, Hey Vav Hey, wouldn't they have just written it in the Paleo-Hebrew? Now, we don't have that manuscript of Acts in Hebrew. It doesn't exist as far as I know, right? Where it's written in Greek, but with Paleo-Hebrew.
You're one of the few people on the planet who would know, who's done the search.
I haven't found that one yet.
Okay.
Maybe one day. I hope so. But in any event, even if they wrote it in Greek or translated it into Greek, they would have written the name Yehovah in Paleo-Hebrew and then eventually changed it with Lord. And this is an important point because I deal with some Christians who will say, well, Nehemiah, you're not one of us. You're not a Christian. So you don't understand. Every word in the Greek New Testament is God-breathed. Every Greek word. And if you try to say that the original was Hebrew, you're saying it's just a translation. Well, the church fathers said it was a translation. Papias said in the first century, I quote it in my book, Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, he said, Matthew wrote the words in the Hebrew language and each translated them as he was able. That's the earliest testimony of the Gospel of Matthew from around the year 100, give or take, from this man named Papias, a church father. So this isn't Nehemiah, the non-believer, who's saying this. This is the church father saying it, that some of these words at least were written in Hebrew and then translated. And so I don't want to get into your theology.
Other church fathers said that they saw the Hebrew Matthew.
Jerome says in the 5th century, he was in Caesarea Maritima on the shore of what today is Israel, and he saw a copy of the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. So we know there were Hebrew documents that were translated into Greek. unless you just think the church fathers made it all up, which some scholars do. But if you believe the earliest testimony we have of these gospels, that some of them were written in Hebrew and translated into Greek, and that definitely seems to be the case from the internal evidence. I talk about that in the book Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. I think, and I can't prove it because I don't have the original document, but it makes sense to me that the earliest Greek version of Acts would have been just like the Greek version of Joel, which was written in Greek until it got to the name and it was written in Paleo-Hebrew. And over time, we know that in the Joel, it was replaced with kurios in the Greek, not in the Hebrew. And presumably the same thing happened in Acts, that when they came to that name, Hey Vav Hey, Yehovah, they changed it to Lord, because they did the same thing in the Old Testament. And so it should come to pass, who shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But what Peter spoke in the first century, it makes sense that this would have been Yehovah, certainly to the audience. Now this is one of the...
And again, Yeshua's first words,
Yehovah, Yoshia.
Yoshia.
Right. Now, Michael, one of the things I've heard from, and I'm talking about like I'm not talking about like internet stuff. I'm talking about like solid Christian scholars. In fact, there was a man who wrote a book called Yahweh at Patmos. And Yahweh of Patmos, written by Professor Sean McDonough in 1999. And this is considered the definitive work in Christian scholarship that proves that Jesus Christ never spoke the name Yehovah or Yahweh. He's not even dealing with how to pronounce it. He's saying that name, which in later Jewish tradition was forbidden, that Jesus followed the ban on speaking the name. He argues this in a book. It's a great book. I've read it. And it has some wonderful things in it. But I think one of the things he's missing is what we just saw, which is that in the earliest manuscripts where they wrote in Greek, when it came to the name, they wrote it as Yod Hey Vav Hey, as Yehovah in Paleo-Hebrew, and it was the Christian Gentile scribes who replaced that with Lord. So I think he misses that point. But, one of the things I shared with you, Michael, is that I've come across in my research, we talked about Hebrew Matthew. Well, recently I discovered a Hebrew manuscript of the book of Revelation. And this Hebrew Revelation, it's only a chapter and a half. But one of the really...
That's all that's extant.
That's all that I found. That's all, that's all that I know of. It's, and the beauty of it is today anybody can go online to the British Library, which used to be the British Museum Library, go to the British Library website. It's part of a worldwide project of digitizing all Hebrew manuscripts. And this manuscript is called Sloan 273. And let me pull it up here. I have it right in front of me, and we'll show it here on the screen. And let me just see here real quick. And the beautiful thing here is in this passage in Revelation. And can you read me Revelation? I believe it's 1:4. What do you have there in Revelation 1:4? Read me that from the Greek. And this is actually the basis of the idea of Yahweh at Patmos. Is he starts off and he says, look, Jesus at Patmos, when he revealed himself to John, he didn't use the name Yehovah. He revealed himself in a very different way. And I'm sorry, it's actually 1:8.
Okay, yeah, okay. This is King James. Yeah. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty.
So here, according to the understanding of this Yahweh at Patmos by McDonough, and most Christian scholars, this is Jesus talking, and he's saying, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. That's what it means, the first and the last letters of the alphabet. And now was the chance to say that he's Yehovah, and he doesn't say it. And the beautiful thing here is in this Hebrew manuscript in the British Library. Now, is this the Hebrew original? I don't know. This is one of these manuscripts that shows up, and we don't know if it was translated from Greek or if this is an early Hebrew manuscript.
And it isn't. It's a manuscript. It's handwritten. It is ancient.
It shows up. This particular manuscript, I believe, was purchased in the 17th century. It probably shows up. It was probably written about 100 years before that. And here's what it says in Hebrew. He says, "Ani ha'alef ve'hatav." I am the Aleph and the Tav. Omer Yehovah ha'Elohim. Says Yehovah Elohim, Yehovah God. So here he's speaking, the speaker here saying, I'm the Aleph and the Tav. And it's beautiful because in Greek it says Alpha and Omega, which is the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. The first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet are Aleph and Tav. Now I've heard people speculate that in the original Hebrew it wouldn't have said Alpha and Omega, it would have said Aleph, Tav. Okay, that could be. Here I have it.
Here you have it.
I have it in a manuscript. And then it says Yehovah God. And Yehovah there is written with the full vowels as Yehovah, not as Yahweh, not as Yahuwah, but as Yehovah from this manuscript. It's beautiful. And one of the things that's missing that I think is lost when you translate this into Greek is what you just read. And read that one more time, the end of the verse where he says, I am the Almighty.
Which is, which was, and which is to come, the Almighty.
Was and is to come. When I hear that, I immediately hear that in Hebrew, which is the Hebrew phrase, Haya Hoveh Yehiyeh, which literally can be translated, he was, he is to come, or you can change the order. And in fact, in Revelation, it appears 3 times. Sometimes it appears he is, he was, or he was, he is. That's not important in Hebrew. But the meaning of the name Yehovah, the meaning of the name of the Father, Yod Hey Vav Hey, is Haya Hoveh Yehiyeh. He was, he is to come. That's the translation, the meaning of the name. And it says it there in Revelation.
Right,
and
1:8, and it goes right back to when Moses was given the name. What shall I tell them your name is?
It's beautiful. Right.
Take us to...
Right, well, so Michael, I was recently, and I do this podcast called Hebrew Voices, and I was interviewing this Samaritan leader, man who's written 107 books. Really smart guy. He's considered the top Samaritan scholar, meaning among the Samaritans. And I asked him the question which was obvious to me. I said, how do you Samaritans pronounce God's name, Yod Hey Vav Hey? He says, we don't pronounce the name. I said, really? Okay, well, how'd you pronounce it in ancient times? He said, we never pronounced it. Interesting, and we can get back to that maybe. But he says, but I can tell you what it means. I said, well, what does it mean? I know what it means, but what do you think it means? He says it means Haya Hoveh Yehiyeh. He was, he is to come. So why do you think it means that? I know why it means that. And he said the same reason any Jew would say. Exodus 3:14, God reveals himself to Moses and he says, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, which literally is, I will be that which I will be, or I am that which I am. And that is from the Hebrew verb to be. And in the very next verse, he says, and Yehovah said further to Moses, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, and then he reveals his name, Yehovah, Yod Hey Vav Hey. And what you have to understand is when you read this in Hebrew, this is patently obvious. When you have the prefix, the aleph prefix, as an ehiyeh, asher ehiyeh, it means I am. And when you have the yud prefix, as in Yehovah, it means he will be. So Yehovah presents himself and says, I will be that which I will be. And he says, this is what you're going to call me. You're not going to call me I am. You're going to call me Yehovah, which is a combination of the 3 forms of the verb Haya, Hoveh, Yehiyeh. Even the Samaritans know that. Every Jew knows that. We sing it in the synagogue. I grew up singing it in the synagogue. Vehu Haya, Vehu Hoveh, Vehu Yehiyeh B'tifara. Every synagogue in the world, maybe they have a different tune and maybe they sing it better than me, but every synagogue in the world, they know that the name means Haya, Hoveh, yeah, and even the book of Revelation. To me, Michael, that's 3 witnesses. The Samaritans, and you can't tell me the Samaritans got this from the Jews, right? They say they have their independent line of information. According to 2 Kings 17, that independent line of information goes to the time of the time of Hezekiah, 700 BC. Right? They were broken off from the Jews from 700 BC, and they know what they learned from their priests that came from the 10 tribes is the name means Haya Hoveh Yehiyeh. Jews know it's Haya Hoveh Yehiyeh, and even the book of Revelation says 3 times it says it, that his name is, he says, was, is, and is to come. That's the meaning of the name Yehovah. So the actual name's lost in the Greek, but the meaning of the name appears. They didn't lose that. And the reason is there was no ban on the meaning of the name. The Jewish ban and the Roman ban pertained to the pronunciation of the name Yehovah, but the meaning of the name, I don't think the Romans even knew the significance of that. They didn't catch it. They didn't tie into it. It's beautiful. It's right there in this Hebrew revelation.
Oh,
and in the Greek, it's even there in the Greek. That's the beauty of it.
So his book, Yahweh on Patmos, what comes out of Patmos refutes everything that he says, that his name was not spoken coming from Patmos in Hebrew.
At least this Hebrew manuscript of it does. And one of the interesting things, Michael, I was curious because, look, I feel like when we're talking about the Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, we're on really solid ground. We can trace it back definitively to a 14th century rabbi who copied it from some earlier source. With this Hebrew revelation, we're at the beginning of the research. I can't say definitively this is our Hebrew original. So out of curiosity, I decided to look at 2 texts of Revelation in Hebrew that I know they were translated from Greek.
Okay.
And one of them was made by a Christian Gentile named Franz Delitzsch, and the other was by a Jew named Salkinson who converted to Christianity. And both of them were in the 1800s. Delitzsch's purposes, he was actually a great scholar of Hebrew grammar, Franz Delitzsch. And he said, I want to present the New Testament in a style that sounds like biblical Hebrew for the Jews. The other one, Salkinson, was a Jew, and he had actually read the New Testament in Hebrew, and he said, this isn't Hebrew, this is horrible Hebrew. Some Gentile translated this, I can't even understand it. He said, I want to translate it in a way that my people will understand it, meaning Jews. Mm-hmm. And if they read it and they reject it, at least they'll understand what it says as a Hebrew book. So both of them independently translated the book of Revelation and the whole New Testament, by the way. You can actually get these online. Beautiful thing is both of these are translations from Greek, and we know who translated them in the 1800s, and you can see them online today. And both of them translate verbatim, I am the Aleph and the Tav Yehovah Elohim. Now, what that shows you, whether this Hebrew revelation is an original Hebrew text, or if it's translated from Greek, if you want to insist that, it shows that three independent sources all looked at the Greek and realized what this had to say in the Hebrew would be, I am the Aleph and the Tav, Yehovah Elohim. And what I love about Salkinson and Delitzsch is they were writing for Jewish audiences, and they didn't even occur to them to write Yahweh, because no Jew would pick that up and say, oh yeah, that sounds like Hebrew. They'd pick that up and say, this is not a Hebrew word. What is this Yahweh? So they wrote it the way every Jew who had a knowledge of the name would certainly in the 1800s understand it was Yehovah. It's the way it's written in printed Bibles in the 1800s. And we'll talk about that in a different, if we have time. I think it's beautiful. Three independent sources. One may be in original Hebrew, maybe translated, I don't know. The other two are for sure translated. And all three say, I am the Aleph and the Tav, Yehovah Elohim. And, so this guy who's writing about Yahweh at Patmos, he's got some wonderful scholarship, but I have to disagree with his conclusion that that Yeshua was under the ban on the name. As far as I can find from the Jewish sources, the ban on the name didn't exist in the first century. The only people who followed the ban on the name in the first century were the Samaritans who never spoke the name, and we have evidence for that. And the Essenes who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed the name was too holy to pronounce. The Pharisees actually had a teaching that when you greet your fellow, you must greet him using the name. And they explain what they mean. They explain that they quote Boaz walking on the road to Bethlehem, and he sees the harvesters in the fields, and they're covered in the dirt and grime of the fields. Like these aren't people who are sanctified in the temple. And he says to them, Yehovah imachem, Yehovah be with you. And they say to him, Yevarechecha Yehovah, Yehovah bless you. And the rabbis say in the first century, this is the greeting of ancient Israel. This is the way that we are culturally, the way we greet people. And they bring another example from Gideon. When the angel sees him, he says, Yehovah be with you. And the beauty of the story there is that Gideon in Judges 6, he thinks, well, this is just a greeting. It's like he's saying to me, hello, how are you? And the angel says, no, when I say Yehovah is with you, I mean he's with you. Like he mistakes it for a greeting at first. But he's like, no, I'm not just anybody saying this. I'm, an angel saying this. Beautiful, beautiful things there. So the point is, in the first century, that's an anachronism to say that Yeshua didn't speak the name. There was a rabbi I've talked about in my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence, and in the Open Door series, I talk about this. There was a rabbi named Hanina ben Turadion, who during the time of the Hadrianic persecutions, he was a rabbi, and he was burned at the stake by the Romans, we're told, for speaking the name the way it was written, meaning as Yehovah. Instead of saying Adonai, he actually spoke the name, and this was in response to the Roman ban on speaking the name. It started out as a Roman persecution. He said, if you forbid us to speak it, I'm going to speak it publicly. And it cost him his life. And the Roman persecution of Hadrian, just to give you an idea, Hadrian died, and so the persecutions continued up until the year 138. That's 100 years after Yeshua's ministry. There was a rabbi burned at the stake for speaking the name. So you're telling me Yeshua, when he was preaching in Galilee, didn't speak the name? And do we have time to get to John 17, Michael?
Nehemiah,
it's exciting.
We don't.
Oh,
Let me stop right here. I've got to do this. Nehemiah's book, shattering the conspiracy of silence. You just heard a tidbit here. 100 years after Yeshua, the rabbis in the Galilee,
in Galilee.
The grave is still there of that rabbi in the Galilee, burned alive in the streets with a Torah scroll wrapped around him because he was going against the Roman ban to speak the name. And that his name, the name of the Almighty, has been hidden basically in plain sight, but in documents never translated over into the English. Ladies and gentlemen, I was reading this book. I got it from Nehemiah just before heading over to Israel. I was on the plane. I began reading it. And the third time, I was sitting there just weeping openly, and I said, I got to put this thing down. I just can't be crying in this plane on the way to Israel because it is so beautifully constructed and in telling the story. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. That's why we're taking the time to do this, because there is coming a time that not only the Gentiles, but all of Israel are implored to call upon the name, the real name, not some kind of Gentile abomination, not some kind of stretching the wild imagination, but Nehemiah is going to take you into manuscripts, never translated into any other language, things that have been hidden for centuries that has now been uncovered as part of Nehemiah. This thing, as far as this project, this is brought to into the mix, thousands of manuscripts that have never been seen before.
Michael, I've had access to over 1,500 manuscripts that I've been searching for the full vowels of the name, and we'll talk about that.
1,500, more than that?
It's actually more than that. That's one collection in one library is 1,500, and because it's part of this worldwide project of digitizing all Hebrew manuscripts. The other thing I was accessing that I'll hopefully talk about is I have a database. It's actually on a flash drive that you get from Bar-Ilan University. I paid over $1,000 for it. It has over 100,000 Hebrew books in it. And I was able to search that for information on how to pronounce the name. And it's definitive that the Jewish sources say the name of the Father, according to its true pronunciation, is Yehovah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're doing. Right now, I'm telling Nehemiah right on the air, I'm paying for that. Okay? The $1,000 I'm giving to Nehemiah, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you get involved in it, okay? I'm involved, and here it is. Shattering the conspiracy of silence. Ladies and gentlemen, it's going out to you now. Be a part of history. Be a part of Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Nehemiah, you got to come back. I want to hear about how Yeshua speaks the name and makes his name known. Would you close with the Aaronic blessing?
Absolutely. Yehovah Avinu Shebashamayim, Yehovah our Father in heaven, thank you for this wonderful blessing you gave to Aaron and his sons. Yevarechecha Yehovah v'yishmerecha. Yehovah bless you and keep you. Ya'er Yehovah panav elecha v'chuneka. Yehovah shine his face towards you and be gracious towards you. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Yehovah lift his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Well, Shabbat Shalom to our fans. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. We'll see you back here.